Hello, I'm Chris Butler, Group Product Manager at the Google's Core Machine Learning Group. And sorry I couldn't be there in person, but still wanted to share some of this information with you about really making space for decision discourse, which I think is a key aspect that people maybe don't think about enough. So when I talk about decision making, right, decision making, I think from like a very meta standpoint, is broken down into five different kind of pieces. So first, we have identification, which is how do we actually understand that we need to now make a decision with other people, right? We make decisions all the time just by ourselves. You know, if someone's coding something, they're making decisions a lot, or if a PM is starting to write out something like a PRD or a specification, there's plenty of decisions that they end up stacking into the same thing. But what I guess I'm talking about here is that whenever we need to, there's a singular decision that needs to be made that will have a big impact on maybe a cross-functional team, needs to actually have people engage in some way. That is the type of decision making that I'm talking about here. And then next, the part that I want to talk about mostly today is about this, really this concept of discourse around a decision. And I'll talk about why this is important. But I think a lot of the time when people think about decision making, they're actually thinking about the discourse component and then this singular moment where someone decides. And they're jamming those things together, and there's a lot of anti-patterns that end up being created because of that. And so we'll talk a bit about like how should we be separating these things in some way. After someone does make a decision, there needs to be communication of that decision out to a bunch of different people. And generally the group that is part of the discourse, part of the decision, part of the communication, they could be very different groups of people. And in fact, that communication could not only try to consider the people that are impacted by the decision, so say other teams, but it could result in, documentation for end customers in some way. And that could be the other part of the communication that is necessary. And then finally, every decision-making process should have a step by which they try to learn from the decision-making process itself. And when I say learn from the decision-making process, I don't mean necessarily, just from the very basic standpoint, was this a good outcome or a bad outcome from the decision-making process? But I think overall, like, was this decision process that we followed, the way that we ended up creating the discourse, the way we made the decision, the way we communicated out, was it valuable for the people? And did it work out the way we wanted it to? And if it didn't work out the way we wanted to, what would we have done different with the same information to be able to, say, make decision-making overall better in the future? And while I draw this as kind of like one end-to-end type of process, there's lots of loops that are inside of here as well, right? You may end up having a big discussion and then go to the decision point, and the decision makers feel like you haven't, I guess, considered all the options they would have wanted. So you have to go back to discourse, or you may try to communicate something out, and there is a stakeholder or a group of people that are impacted that you forgot to include, and so you need to go back to the discourse. And then finally, the loop of kind of like learning and reusing that when entering in new discourses, I think is really powerful and very important. So this is what I mean when I talk about decision making. And so what this like leads us to is, maybe why should we have this discourse component where we're trying to make decisions with other people? Why is this valuable? And so, this is related to the kind of, I guess, consideration of cognitive biases as understood, in this book by Daniel Kahneman. But in general, like, how is it that as individuals, we end up suffering from these cognitive biases that, if you look at the Wikipedia page, it's something like 130 of them. There's lots of different ways that we've created shortcuts as human beings that then makes us, I think from a purely rational standpoint, look like we're making mistakes. Now, there's a lot of discussion about whether these are really mistakes or not, or whether these are heuristics and kind of the way that we actually build intuition. And I would say that is an important discussion. But part of the reason why I think most of this discourse or discussion ends up being about individual cognitive biases. And what I would like to take us to is that there was a study recently that gave people as individuals that would suffer from biases in this decision-making process a task. And so this task is that I'm going to now show you, and this will be something we can do right now, 4 different cards, and each one will have a letter on one side and a number on the other. And so I want you to now, as individuals, to think about what cards you need to turn out of those 4 to actually test this particular rule. And that particular rule is all cards with vowels on one side have an even number on the other. And so you only want to select as many of these cards as you think are necessary to be able to prove this rule. And so So now let's do this right now. What I'm going to show you are these 4 cards. And these are the 4 cards. And I want you to think to yourself right now, which of these cards would I turn over to be able to prove all cards with vowels on one side have an even number on the other? So if you think about this for a moment, and you want to choose the minimum number of cards ideally, but you could choose all 4 if you thought that was the right answer. And so the question becomes, which cards would you turn over? And so again, if you look at these, if you had to prove that rule, that for any cards that have a vowel on one side, they have an even number on the other, what are the 2 cards you'd have to turn over? So now, the correct answer for this set of cards is actually U and 7. And what's really interesting about this is that if we just pose this to individuals, right, on their own, about 1 in 5 people get it right. And so the other people end up suffering from a lot of different types of cognitive biases about the way they would select this. And they're not being purely rational, they're not being purely logical, but that's what ends up happening. Now, if you try this test together in a group of 4 to 5 people, and you allow them to have a conversation before the selection actually takes place, you actually go to about 80% of the time people will get it right. So 4 out of 5 times people will get it right. And I think what's really powerful about this is this shows the value that, like, even though we may suffer from these individual biases when we're trying to make a decision, we actually benefit from the fact that as a group we end up having a conversation. And there's a lot of reasons why, but some of them end up being because when we're hearing from other people, we can start to take a third-party view of the options. We can start to discuss the pros and cons, and having that kind of like someone outside of my head having a conversation, having to explain the reason why I believe something or think something, ends up being really valuable. And so this leads us to discourse, right? Which the discourse component of the decision-making process is highly valuable. And I would say we need to take specific care around how we do this. Now, the way that we actually start the discourse should actually be about something that I'll call deciding how to decide. So deciding how to decide ends up being a couple different things that we need to figure out up front about how we should have this discourse, and then how we'll eventually have the decision-making process. And the reason why is that it ends up helping us set up for the future things that we'll be able to, at least by adhering to these different steps, we will then be able to probably make a good decision. And if we need to change those things, or we need to iterate on that over time, we can start to then build intuition about how we should decide how to decide in the future for different types of decisions. So the first thing is, what does the discourse require? What types of inputs do we need to be able to even have a good conversation? And that leads us to who should be in the discourse, right? Who is actually the right group of people to come in and talk about this type of thing. We then want to time box this in some way. We want to say, when do we ideally want to make this decision? Or when do we want to either defer or make a decision? Or when's the last responsible moment that we want to make this decision? We should then decide who should decide. And that can be a very different group. Ideally, it's a much smaller group, right? You probably want to collect lots and lots of information from different people during the discourse, but then go down to just like one or a small handful of people that have to decide in some way together. And sometimes that may not make sense, and it requires a lot of people. But I would say, like, in general, the fewer people that are part of the decision-making process, the better. And then we decide how we should decide. And I'll talk about what this means, but when we have multiple people involved, we may actually choose a way to decide whether we move forward or not between all those people. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. But these are the key things that right before you end up entering into this discourse component, we should talk about these things. We should set them down. We should write them down somewhere so that we can actually track and decide. The next thing is this container for the discourse. So once we've entered into discourse, there's a bunch of different ways that we need to think about the actual way that we've set this up, right? And so what I mean by container could really mean a lot of things. Like, this is, the conference that we're in right now is a particular container. The people that are here, the message that I have, the way that I'm delivering this conversation, these are all kind of like attributes of the container. And so I think, like, we should talk a bit about, like, what are some ideal attributes for that container in some way. And so what we do during the discourse, right, could be things like we will decide how to decide first. We may do that as like the beginning part of this in a meeting somewhere. We need to provide time for people to parse and think about what the problem is, right? So what is the decision we're trying to make? How are we trying to do it? What are all the different things that I'd want to bring to this decision-making process that might be helpful as part of the discourse? We need to disagree in some way. And I think this is most important for us to be able to get the benefits of multiple people having a conversation. We need to be able to have not everybody thinking the same, and that usually leads to disagreement, which is beneficial. We want to create the options that we're now going to consider. We want to refine those options, right? So we want to find out pros and cons about them, collapse them down if they're too similar, split them out if they're too dissimilar, or even just the idea of like saying at a very high level, we're going to consider these options right now, but definitely not these options, right? So even just doing that ends up creating a really valuable discourse so that you're doing a lot of the work for the decision makers before you even get there. And so what would it mean for us to actually create better containers for this type of thing? So I just talked about what I usually would do inside these containers, but I think there's certain things that you should be doing to really do this well. And so I think the first thing that I just want to mention here is that meetings are not a bug, right? I hear about a company almost every couple months that says we're just going to cancel all the meetings and we're going to go back to pure async work. And I don't think that works. And the reason why is because for the last thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, we've used this type of discourse, this ability to communicate between us as a way for us to actually have a better decision-making process. And so while there may be plenty of meetings that are ill-formed or bad containers, it doesn't mean that meetings are bad. And I would even argue that ad hoc meetings themselves, the idea of like a water cooler conversation helping solve something, it's a particular type of container, and we can help foster those types of containers too. There's very specific and like kind of ways that we can do this. And so I just want to make sure that's very clear. I don't consider meetings a bug, and I would argue that we shouldn't really like badmouth meetings if we're not even going to put any type of, I guess, oversight or actual energy into creating good ones, because I don't think most people do. So what are some things that we should do when we're dealing with this discourse? So the first one that I would say is I found that kind of like the diamond approach to diverge and converge, I think that this idea of creating or collecting options asynchronously, so through documentation, through other types of processes, including the idea of like virtual, even kind of creating ideas through an ideation session with post-it notes, it ends up being kind of like an asynchronous way of dealing with this. But then we should be really, to discuss the controversy within our things, we should use various methods to actually create better discourse around the controversy, usually synchronously. And the reason why I say that is because I think we end up losing so much when it comes to kind of emotional cues, body language, things like that, that are really vital in having a good disagreement, that it sometimes doesn't work when we're trying to do it purely asynchronously, especially when some of those conversations have to be within like, threaded boards like Slack and Discord or Spaces, or inside of a document where you're really just given this like narrow band on the side of a document to be able to have a conversation through comments. So I think this is like pretty important to be able to do. The next thing is that as part of, if you're say a product manager or someone that is really like helping facilitate this decision-making process, you should try to do as little as possible to actually sell any particular solution. Eventually, you may give a recommendation. You may force a decision to be made with a particular way. But I would argue that you don't want to actually sell any particular decision yet, because what you're trying to do is trying to have the best conversation about the possible options. The next thing is, as I said before, when we try to decide how to decide and we set the time box, I think this is actually very powerful, that when we don't set time boxes, we don't require people to make hard decisions. And so I think that is really our job as a facilitator, is to kind of force harder decisions. And again, that hard decision could be deferment, but at least at the very least, we want to be able to have a time that we need to set that says we are going to do it within this time frame. The next thing I would say is that you will receive lots of feedback during this discourse. So during that feedback, you'll get lots and lots of people not only kind of giving feedback on the options themselves, but about the attributes of those options, maybe even stack ranking or separating options from we'll consider versus not, everything like that. You may even receive feedback on the process itself. And that is all helpful, right? We want to receive feedback as much as possible, but it doesn't mean that we actually are required to address all feedback. We may hear feedback and decide not to move on. I think part of having a really growth mindset around these things is to know when you should and shouldn't actually take on feedback. And this is probably the best example of this is through a book called Thank You for the Feedback, which the first third of the book is really just about like, how do you actually give great timely feedback? The second 2/3 of the book is really, from my opinion, like, how do we actually get feedback and decide whether we want to act on it? So I would definitely suggest that we do not have to take action on everything. We should consider what we want to consider and what we think is valuable, but it doesn't mean that we have to address or even fix every piece of decision that's out there potentially. And then the last piece that I think is still very much like a work in progress for a lot of organizations is how do we end up tracking these decisions? So sometimes it may be inherent in the way that you have like a review meeting that has a sign-up sheet, and then there's notes and videos that come out of those things with a brief document. But I think like this is something where if you don't have that type of mechanism, you do need to start to create a log of these things. And it ideally isn't just like a littering of documents across Google Drive. So this is something I think everybody needs to improve on. I still feel like the best way is through those types of cadences of meetings, but I still think there's an awful lot of work to kind of figure out about decision making. So methods for disagreement. How do we actually have valuable disagreements with people? And I would start to say that like a few that I've found to be really interesting and valuable might be things like the pre-mortem from Gary Klein. How are we all like imagining a world where things didn't work out? And how do we actually do that in some way that is valuable and gets us further in the conversation? Something called Ritual Dissent by Dave Snowden. So Dave Snowden created the Cynefin framework and then SenseMaker as a product. And he talks a lot about that, there's one way to be able to get people to dissent, even during kind of conversations between people of different power differentials. Like, I think this idea, it's basically where you present an idea, there's no talking to you about it, maybe some clarifying questions, but that's it. And then you turn around physically and don't say anything while people give you feedback. And it ends up breaking a lot of kind of the concern and anger and upsetness that can happen out of receiving really kind of critical feedback about ideas. And I think is like a really interesting approach. The next thing I would say is this concept of double crux, which comes from CFAR, which is the Center for Something Rational Thinking, essentially. And so double crux is about that a lot of the time disagreements are not so much about surface disagreements where it's not as simple as just a difference of understanding of information. It actually ends up being a values judgment difference that is the reason why we're disagreeing. And so double crux is about how do we get to that like place where if one thing was different, we would be in agreement. And I think this is very valuable for a lot of people, especially because they end up having arguments over things that is really at the surface level rather than getting to the values, which are probably where the difference lies, actually. The next thing I would say is this kind of overall methodology around principled disagreement by the Ready, and there's workshops that they offer, but it's really how do we take a stance of allowing for certain types of disagreement that will be more helpful rather than hurtful. Delegation poker is something I've used a lot to be able to understand like differences in understanding of a situation. This is very similar to like planning poker, where if you're sitting around with a group of people and you want to ask about like for this work item, what's the complexity of this work item, and everybody chooses say a number of 1 to 7 or Fibonacci sequence or something like that, we all throw our cards down at the same time. And it's not so much like when we agree. When we agree, we just move on. But when we disagree, we want to look at how vast that disagreement, the variance is across all the disagreement, because in those cases, there's clearly something that we're not understanding about each other's stances on this. And so planning poker to me, or sorry, a delegation poker or those types of things, that the ability to disagree like that ends up really outlining the things we should discuss that are real disagreements versus the things that we should not discuss or not worry about as much. Boris, which is an interesting named workshop by Von Tan, really tries to get at like what are the differences and trade-offs that we need to make right now. And so those trade-offs may be say between different functionalities like sales and marketing and product and engineering. There's different trade-offs that they all need to worry about. And so how will we as a group weigh these different trade-offs? And that workshop is meant to do that, because I think a lot of the time you're never going to satisfy everybody within a particular or maybe even anybody within a particular decision-making system, but you will try to actually satisfy them. And so that means what are the trade-offs that are worth making between different roles? And then the last thing that I use that's kind of like a more generic method is really this like lean coffee-like disagreement. And so lean coffee is a system where if you don't have a meeting agenda, you basically ideate a bunch of ideas at the beginning of a meeting, then you have everybody dot vote them, and then you basically get a prioritized list of things that group cares about overall. And so the way I've used this is say in a prioritization exercise where we had stack ranked buckets and then items in all those buckets, and loose ranking, but not like not so much that it's like everything's been pushed into one list. What we end up doing after we've given a first blush based on a couple different like factors, we can then say, all right, for everything that's on here, I want everybody to highlight the thing that they disagree with the most. We're going to dot vote for what is the most disagreement here. And what that allows us to do, and that as well as like a certain amount of time boxing, like 5 minutes per topic, and then addition, like getting voting to add more, you end up keeping the conversation moving really kind of in a really effective way of just going after the things that are most into disagreement. And so I think that ends up being a very valuable kind of way to do discussions. And so, I think like overall, right, the thing that we're trying to do when we are breaking up this like discourse and discussion and kind of decision making ends up being that we don't want all of these things to be slammed together so that we mistake where we are. And a lot of the time, people will spend way more time than they should on kind of like oscillating back and forth in the same meeting between discourse and decision making, rather than actually getting the discourse kind of written down, agreed to that this is the discourse that should be coming out of it, and then who's the decision. And so, I think that is probably one of the most important things that we can do, is to really make space for this discourse overall. When we don't do that, we spend hours and hours in meetings kind of rehashing the same thing over and over again, and trying to make a decision, but can't because we haven't had the full discourse yet. And so that's what I'd say is I think like really trying to focus in on that is incredibly important. And so if you're interested in these types of things, this is something that I talk about a lot on the Uncertainty Project. And so this is an example of a post that I've written really about like this decision discourse aspect. But we just surpassed 1,000 newsletter subscriptions about a month or so ago. And we're constantly posting new models and techniques, posts about kind of how we're thinking about not only decision making, but strategy, in the way that strategy actually should inform decision making. Because I would argue like most strategies are really just like a decision between two really good things at maybe a higher level abstraction. And so being better about one, trying to set a decision as a strategy, right, as a governing kind of constraint on top of these organizations, I think we allow for everybody else's decision making to become more efficient underneath that. When we don't actually allow for people to get guidance from the leaders within an organization, I think we really do them an injustice, because they have to make every decision themselves. When the reality is like those decisions that they're trying to make themselves still have to be escalated to be able to be approved. And so I think overall there's a real need for this type of thinking. And I would just like reiterate that really separating out these things, understanding how strategy actually impacts your decision making within your org, making space and inside the process to be able to have this type of conversation, I think is incredibly valuable. And so with that, thank you very much. I would love to connect if people are open to that on LinkedIn. This is also my email address and Twitter handle. Thank you so much for your time today. I really hope that you try out some of these discourse kind of changes to the way you do things. And thank you so much for having me here. Bye.